This is a country shrouded in secrecy, and I use the term country loosely because what you're about to see today is that the word country becomes quite problematic when we are discussing a foreign body but an abstract terminology of foreign when there isn't actually any material land in sight. So let me explain a little bit more how this, in a way, is the smallest country in the world. Behind me is technically and kind of the smallest country in the world. And I say technically because actually it's an entity rather than actual land. However, for the first time in several hundred years, its feet are back on its foundation and original soil. And you'll realise what I mean in a second. So the Sovereign Military Order of Malta have a 99-year lease at their original birthplace for the first time in hundreds of years. Here at Fort St. Angelo in Birgu, which is just opposite Valletta in the Grand Harbour in Malta. And just across the way you can also see St. John's Cathedral, which we're also going to head to later today because of the connection and the history that I'm about to tell you about in this video. Now, whilst the official seat of the Sovereign Military Order is at the Palazzo Malta in Rome, really its traditional seat, where it originated from, it's here. And I think it's agreeable that this is its rightful home, especially when the Sovereign Military Order of Malta built Valletta themselves and restored Fort St. Angelo. Let's go explore all around today. So if you ever decide to visit Fort St. Angelo, it's actually quite an interesting day out because the bottom of Fort St. Angelo covers an immense history about the fort throughout time because it is also the main fort that guarded the Grand Harbour. Hence the Knights of Malta actually wanting it as a position originally before the Great Siege, but currently they reside only in the top section. So that is where we are heading up to right now. It's very, very steep. The lower part of Fort St. Angelo actually houses a mini museum showing you some of the weaponry from the time, but really what we're discussing today is how the upper section of Fort St. Angelo is kind of the world's smallest country. So let's head over to the main gate. Even though the Sovereign Military Order of Malta don't technically have any national territory and are just an entity under international law, this is where their current seat is. And a quick few facts. So first of all, even though we shorten it to the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, officially it is the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John, Jerusalem, Rhodes and Malta, commonly known as the Knights of Malta or the Order of Malta. It was originally founded in 1530 at this very site behind me, but in 1565 in the Great Siege of Malta it moved to within the city walls of Valletta, and as I've already said, the city walls of Valletta were built entirely by the Knights of St. John or the Knights of Malta. And St. John's Cathedral, just over the way, which we're going to see a little bit later, was their main church. The Great Siege of Malta actually lasted an astounding 4 months, but it's what actually halted the expansion of the Ottoman Empire here in Malta. Behind me here is actually a monument placed and laid in 1787, which was to commemorate all the fallen knights in the Great Siege of Malta. The Knights of St. John, or rather Knights of Malta, was officially founded in 1099 by the Blessed Gerard in the First Crusade. As it is actually considered a country, it has its own currency, which is the Maltese scudo. They even have their own passports, stamps and coins. So I think that pretty much kind of makes it a country, even though technically it doesn't have its own landmass. That is, of course, until now. As I have already mentioned, its former home prior to the Great Siege of Malta, which was Fort St. Angelo, which the Knights of Malta used to own and have in its entirety. They now have this upper section I am currently entering. Despite the Knights of Malta being shrouded in secrecy, I have to add that really they were formed for a very humanitarian reason. They were the first people to ever really offer medical support, or indeed a kind of first hospital to help people in need. And as you will see later when we visit Valletta, there's really still evidence of that within the city walls of Valletta. I actually saw the most pharmacies I have ever seen in a half-mile radius in my entire life. And I have to think, with the pharmacy sign being the cross and the symbol of St. John, it really kind of shows the foundations of medical aid from the Knights of Malta and St. John. Some of you may have even heard of the St. John's ambulance. We definitely have it in England. I'm not sure if it's a thing in the rest of the world, but that is actually a part of the Knights of Malta, or the Knights of St. John, being for medical aid. If you see the cross correlation there are hundreds of branches of the Knights of St. John that have kind of branched out into separate subsidiaries. That being said, now let's have a little explore of the rest of the upper section of Fort St. Angelo, which is technically a leased country for the Knights of St. John. in this smallest country in the world, they've even got things like their own carob trees growing, but it is incredibly tiny. Obviously, it is just a fort, and technically it is just a seat. This area was a particular highlight of mine. It is the dungeon. And this dungeon is quite famous as it was where Caravaggio once escaped from. Caravaggio was actually made a Knight of Malta, which I will explain more about later in this video. But not only that, it was also where they filmed a scene for Game of Thrones, where Sean Bean's character, Mr. Stark, or Lord Stark, was famously held. But more to come on that later. So if I keep saying Fort St. Angelo or Fort St. Angelou throughout this video, it is because in English it is Fort St. Angelo, but in Maltese it is Fort St. Angelou. So technically neither is wrong. And I'm just chopping and changing in between them both. But it is the current home to the Knights of Malta or the Knights of St. John, also, which I will use interchangeably throughout. Now let's head over to the other side of the Grand Harbour, just like the Knights of Malta did themselves when they decided even they would prefer to be even that bit safer within the walls of Valletta City and the St. John's Cathedral. Let's head over. Whilst I head over to St. John's Cathedral, which was the church for the Knights of St. John over in Valletta City, let me explain the Caravaggio statement I made earlier. So Caravaggio was made a Knight of Malta after being commissioned to paint the beheading of St. John for the cathedral. However, it later became apparent that he was on the run from Italy for accidentally killing somebody in a brawl. He then later was rumoured to have even killed a fellow Knight of St. John, which is why they locked him up in the crypt, or aka dungeon as it was used sometimes, although he did eventually escape. However, it is also rumoured via conspiracy that later caught up with him, and an assassin sent from the Knights of Malta did eventually catch him, and he met justice. So behind me here is St. John's Cathedral, which was obviously built by the Knights of St. John, as the entirety of Valletta City was built by the Knights of St. John. This houses the Caravaggio painting, The Beheading of St. John, and it's quite unique because it was actually custom painted and commissioned for the Knights of St. John. So it's been here ever since it was painted. It was painted in this very spot, and it has been here ever since. There are some more of Caravaggio's paintings inside the cathedral, such as Sir Jerome writing, pictured here. The Knights of St. John, aka the Knights of Malta, were so enamoured with the beheading of St. John artwork that is why they actually originally made him a knight himself, before they obviously uncovered the truth. And then it is said that the Grand Master at the time said that they had decided to part ways with such a vulgar creature. So to sum up, I think it's great, for the first time in hundreds of years, the Knights of Malta are officially back in their birthplace of Malta, in the upper tower, or the upper fort of Fort St. Angelo here in Malta. So kind of unofficially the world's smallest country. And they're finally also allowed to fly the flag of the Knights of Malta.